Good morning. It is Tuesday, March the 1st, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Pledge of Allegiance, the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have the No Free Lunch and the New Poverty. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March the 1st. I will teach your hands to war. When my people in Israel repented from their evil ways and cried out to me, I raised up Othniel, Caleb's younger brother, to be a deliverer for them. With my power he overcame their enemies and brought peace to the people. Just as I raised up Othniel, I will raise you up to make war against your enemies. I will teach your hands for war and your fingers for battle. I will be with you like a mighty warrior, so that your persecutors will stumble and not prevail. You will see my vengeance against your enemies, for I have committed my cause to you. I have placed my weapons of war in your hands, and I myself will fight with you. I am the Lord Almighty, and I am mustering an army for war. Psalms 144, verse 1, Judges chapter 3, verses 9 through 11, and Isaiah chapter 13, verse 4. Prayer declaration. You are the Lord all-powerful, and you are bringing together an army for battle. You have prepared your people to fight with you against the wickedness upon the earth. You have filled me with power to fight with you and to declare the return of justice and righteousness to your people. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March the 1st. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is the person that has the courage of his convictions and is confident in what he knows. He is the person that understands that cultural conservatism is more important than political conservatism. He is not selfish, but minds his own business. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He expresses what he knows and does so with certainty. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential. not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American, and he's better than the socialist. He's a better friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. You have to know that. If you don't know with every fiber of your being that being a true conservative is best, then you're wasting your time. Thank you. And now, there's no free lunch. Let me offer you my definition of social justice. I keep what I earn, and you keep what you earn. Do you disagree? Well, then tell me how much of what I earn belongs to you and why. Walter Williams. The real principle being advocated for here by the great Walter Williams is that of private property and the inherent justice in protecting private property. Systems of confiscation undermine justice. For Williams, social justice starts with the premise of protecting the fruits of one's labor, and then it works from there into discussions of how to fund government, charity, etc. The modern social justice movement does it in reverse. They start with the premise that the fruits of one's labor first belong to the social needs of society, then work into what may be left for the earner or laborer. Social justice is a topic in need of extensive treatment, as it is a loaded term, one with great emotional impact, but one that is never used without strong presuppositions. Unpacking those presuppositions, the ideological commitments one brings to the use of the term, must be our priority. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you. And now, the new poverty. If all it took to cease being poor were money, then Lyndon Johnson could fairly claim to have won this war on poverty. In 1980, the federal government counted a family of three as poor if it had a cash income of less than $6,565, or approximately $20,000 in today's funds. On the eve of the Korean War, $20,000 in today's funds happened to be the median income of all American families. In other words, at the end of the 70s, a poor family could afford to buy about as much as a middle-class family could in 1950. Does that sound incredible? It shouldn't. In 1950, more than one-third of all Americans lived in houses without a flush toilet, and more than 15% lived in houses with more than one person to a room. As late as 1960, more than 20% of Americans lived in houses without a telephone anywhere near at hand. Comforts possessed only by the upper two-thirds of American society during the Truman administration were diffused to virtually everybody by the end of the Carter years. By 1980, electricity was so universal that only the Unabomber and vacationing Maine millionaires lacked it. More than 95% of American families possessed indoor plumbing and at least one room per person. Telephones, televisions, and cars were owned by 93% of families. Yet, despite these cheerful statistics, the war on poverty had not been won. Material deprivation had given way to something arguably worse. In 1982, the New York Times columnist Russell Baker published a memoir of his hardscrabble boyhood in Virginia, growing up. Baker's book vaulted into bestsellerdom, and deservedly so. Still, there was something odd about the book's timing and success. 1982 was a bitter political year, the nadir of the inflation-squelching recession, the year of the Reagan budget cuts, and ketchup as a vegetable. Baker's own newspaper almost every day reported some glaring datum that exemplified how the war on poverty had given way to a war on the poor. Yet here was a Times columnist looking back on a poverty far more abject than the worst that Reagan-era America had to show, and recollecting it with a chuckle that it had not really been so bad. Hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom had endured the same hardships as Baker, or worse, plunked down $20 to chuckle along with him. How could that be? Perhaps time had softened their memories, or perhaps Baker and his contemporaries genuinely knew something. In the 1930s, families like Baker's led a middle-class life minus only a middle-class income. Their father's wages might be paltry, but at least they had fathers. Only 3.6% of the children born in America in 1940 were born out of wedlock, and those fathers worked when there was work to be done. After the Depression lifted, virtually every able-bodied male over the age of 18 participated in the labor force. The poor, circa 1980, had food stamps, free food for pregnant women, free dental care, subsidized housing, and any number of other social benefits for whose sake idealistic young people joined the Communist Party in the 1930s. True, inflation corroded the purchasing power of the cash welfare stipend in the early 70s. Nonetheless, welfare remained much more generous in most places in 1980 than it had been in 1960, never mind 1940. But despite that generosity, American poverty bit more savagely and cruelly than ever. To be poor in Baker's time did not imply that one lived in chaos, with mother out all day and children parked in front of the television, with dad replaced by a sequence of boyfriends, in a neighborhood where nobody worked and where fathers never lived with their families, where drugs were openly sold, bullets careened through the courtyards of the housing projects, and junk food was munched on from morning to night. Tragically often, that was precisely what it meant to be poor in 1980. In 1980, there were 27 million poor people in America, or about 12.4% of the population, approximately the same proportion as in 1965. The level of poverty in the United States had not changed much over those 15 years, but its character had. Poverty before 1960, mostly rural and white, became urban and non-white. Almost 70% of America's poor lived in metropolitan areas in 1980. The number of poor people living in urban black majority ghetto neighborhoods jumped by almost 30% between 1970 and 1980. In the biggest cities, the increase in the number of inner-city poor was even more arresting. Philadelphia was home to 50,000 in 1970, 127,000 in 1980, Chicago to 74,000 in 1970, and 194,000 in 1980. This underclass, a term originally coined by the Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal and popularized in a 1982 book by journalist Ken Auletta, tallied perhaps 2.5 million souls nationwide, almost all of them black or Hispanic. 2.5 million people is a small proportion of the total American population. But this relatively minuscule population challenged the country's ideals of equal citizenship and equal human potential more radically than the tens of millions of unemployed in the 1930s had ever done. Back in a minute. Thank you. The young men of the underclass were slaughtering themselves. In 1980, the United States suffered 10.7 murders per 100,000 residents, a horrible murder rate, the worst in the industrial world, and a rate almost exactly double that of 1965. In the same year that the country as a whole suffered those 10.7 per 100,000 murders, black males aged 15 to 24 suffered some 84.3 homicides per 100,000. Black males aged 35 to 44 suffered 110.3, and black males aged 25 to 34 suffered more than 145. Others among the black urban poor turned their rage outward. In 1971 and 72, a group called itself the Black Liberation Army shot and killed 8 white police officers in and around New York City. Police in Illinois charged a gang of 8 black Vietnam veterans with 9 racially motivated murders of whites in October 1972. In a series of killings that the tabloids would dub the Zebra Murders, 4 black Muslims in San Francisco walked up to 18 randomly chosen whites and shot them in the back of the head. A concert that attracted 7,000 white teenagers in Cobo Hall in downtown Detroit in August 1976 was surrounded and besieged by more than 100 black gang members. The concert was halted and the audience was evacuated. The teens were assaulted and robbed on their way out, and one was raped. During the 1980 Miami riot, the nation's worst since 1968, rioters were seen to target white victims. One white man had his ears and tongue cut off. Rioters prevented an ambulance from reaching 3 dying white teenagers. The young men of the underclass had dropped out of the labor force. In 1964, only 10% of non-white males in their early 20s were neither employed nor in school nor in the military. In 1980, more than 25% of non-white males in their early 20s were idle in this way. Between 1959 and 1979, the percentage of black males who engaged in no paid employment at all doubled from 8.2% to 16.4%. Poverty was exacerbated and entrenched by the shrinkage of marriage. In 1969, only 5% of white babies were born out of wedlock. 14.5% of white babies were born outside of marriage in 1986. Among blacks, married motherhood seemed to be disappearing. In 1969, 35% of black children were born to unmarried mothers. In 1986, 62.6%. Among black women who did not complete high school, the illegitimacy rate in 86 was 83%. By the end of the century, 1 out of every American babies would be born to an unmarried woman. Illegitimacy perpetuated the cycle of misery. Children born out of wedlock, black and white, were 250% more likely to be abused than children born to married parents. The Centers for Disease Control reported in 1977. Illegitimacy subjected infant children to the temper of an overwhelmed and despairing mother and the predation of a series of resentful, insecure, and often violent boyfriends. As illegitimacy rates soared, so did injuries to children. Between 1950 and 1975, the homicide rate for children between ages 1 and 4 tripled. In 1975, murder was the leading cause of death of young children in the United States. Back in a minute. Thank you. One prime article of faith of the optimistic 1960s had been the conviction that poor people acted and thought much like everyone else. This conviction inspired 1960s liberals like Robert Kennedy, who attacked the paternalistic bureaucracy of the 1930s-era social work. The same conviction also animated 1960s conservatives like Richard Nixon, who proposed to replace the paternalistic welfare bureaucracy with his family assistance plan, a subsidy delivered through the income tax system that would top up the earnings of the poor to a guaranteed annual minimum. The growth of the underclass shook this cheerful doctrine. The very poor seemed to lack something more than money, the basic skills necessary to make one's way in the modern world. As a vice president of a Chicago television station explained to 2 researchers sympathetic to the employment difficulties of the inner city poor, they go through the Chicago public schools or they dropped out when they were in the 8th grade. They can't read, they can't write, they can hardly talk. So the poverty debate turned full circle, with some of the most radical of the 1960s reformers dusting off an updated version of 1930s paternalism. Hillary Clinton is the most famous advocate of early intervention in the families of the poor, but she is by no means unique. In plenty of other countries, such interventionist policies would not be shocking. European societies have long been organized on the principle that only some people can be trusted to manage their own lives. The rest must be supervised and guided. Per Albin Hansson, the man who led the Swedish Social Democrats to power in 1932 and created the modern Swedish welfare state, habitually compared the relationship between state and its citizens to the relationship between parent and child. We often speak of society, the state, the municipality as our common home. The good home knows no privileged and no disadvantaged, no favorites and no stepchildren. Americans have until now adamantly rejected this concept of the citizen, or some set of citizens, as citizen of the state. Americans might agree that government should provide a hand up to people in momentary distress, but perpetual tutelage for a couple of million of their fellow citizens, that dismayed and appalled them. Yet, tutelage for a considerable minority, custodial democracy, as Charles Murray, who warns against it, has termed it, does seem to appeal to growing sections of the American elite. During the great welfare reform debate of the 1990s, liberals and conservatives staked out positions that would have been indignantly dismissed as outrageously paternalistic 30 years ago. What the welfare poor needed was a firm guiding hand to find them jobs, all sides seemed to agree, compel them to show up at work and babysit their children while they were there. How had the country arrived at this unwanted destination? Students of poverty on the political left prefer to emphasize the bleak prospects the present-day American economy offers to the unskilled, and especially unskilled men. As manufacturing and mining jobs vanish, the gap between the best paid and the least paid widens. Unable to secure steady and decently paid work, unskilled men drop out of the job market entirely, turning to crime, drugs, and petty hustling. These devalued men make poor husband material. They could not support a family even if they wanted to. And the women who bear their children decide that the family can do better without a resentful and useless man. Male children grow up without a father, run wild, fail at school, and on the whole, fearful cycle repeats itself. More conservative analysts emphasize the fatal temptations of welfare, which lured women into a single motherhood, and the disabling culture of the ghetto, which mocked work and education. Perhaps both explanations are true, or partly true. Under pressure from immigration and automation, the wages of the unskilled men did indeed dwindle after 1972, although anyone inclined to romanticize the old blue-collar economy ought to remember that in the 1960s, more men worked as farm laborers than as assembly line workers. Just as the liberals say, and just as the conservatives say, at the same time as the economy was turning against the poor, so was American culture. The poor were bombarded with images of middle-class Americans avoiding marriage and scorning work. Barely half the college-educated young people of 1969, 57%, agreed that hard work always pays off. Cynical talk like that swiftly filtered through to the poor, who were perhaps dispossessed towards cynicism to start with. But the poor lack the margin of error that middle-class people take for granted. They cannot afford even one of the youthful mistakes that others can regret or even chuckle over in the security of middle age. Work and family. These are the two faint light bulbs of hope in the life of the poor. Remove them, and you smash the light, leaving the neediest of our fellow human beings groping for safety in the dark. And that was The New Poverty from the book How We Got Here, the 70s. Thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that seeks consensus. He is subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He's informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He's impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He's deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He's skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, reminding you to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.